This is Horizon's Middle East and Africa. Our top stories this morning. Asian stocks follow Wall Street lower and global bonds tumble as Fed rate cut expectations cool. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is set to arrive in Israel today, his 11th visit to the region since October 7th to broker a ceasefire deal. Plus, election countdown with 2 weeks to go until the United States votes. Polls place Harris and Trump neck and neck. We will get to all of that this morning, but right now it is just past 8 a.m. across the Emirates, 6 a.m. here in South Africa. I'm Jennifer Zabasaja in Johannesburg, in for Jumana Bersetchi this week. And as we mentioned at the top of the show, there's a lot going on in terms of markets right now, where they're positioned. In particular, if you take a look at U.S. equities, they really came under pressure to start the week on Monday, perhaps pulling back after overbought levels as the S&P has gone about 30 sessions without suffering losses. Right now, we're seeing S&P futures and NASDAQ futures both softer. And of course, we've been talking about this for the past few weeks, but Wall Street faces a number of big earnings this week, with roughly 20% of the S&P 500 companies scheduled to release results. Also, a main focal point for us this morning is the global bond sell-off. If you take a look at the 10-year right now, it's at 420.76. Perhaps driving this is commentary that we got on Monday from a number of Fed speakers aligning with a more cautious approach to easing. And as we've been paying attention over the past few months, oil is also in focus for us. Brent crude just above $74 a barrel. That comes after rising almost 2% on Monday as traders continue to track tensions in the Middle East. So a number of factors happening in the markets right now. Let's pivot to markets in Asia to see how they are faring. Avril Hong is standing by in our Singapore studio. Hey, Avril.
Yeah, Jen, as we saw how that global debt sell-off hit what we saw in performance on the U.S. overnight, I think it's really trickled through into this part of the world. And if you're looking at bonds, government bonds in Australia, I think it's about a 14 basis point move that we're seeing on the 10-year. So really steep moves, and stocks, bonds are selling off. Even on the stock markets in Australia, they are leading the declines across the region. It is overall a day when it is risk off as traders assess not just fiscal spending ahead of the U.S. election, but also those recalibrated Fed rate cut expectations. We are seeing a bit of a bright spot in China. Investors still weighing out some of those stimulus moves. Of course, yesterday we had Chinese banks cutting rates by a bit more than was expected, but they had been earlier in the session been struggling for direction more or less. This is what we're seeing today. Jen.
Thanks so much, Avril Hong in Singapore for us. Let's pivot to some breaking news we are getting right at this time, and that is coming from HSBC. We are hearing that the company is now announcing the appointment of Pam Kour as CFO and also Pam Kour as Group CFO. They're saying that they have a simplified structure, hopefully to accelerate strategic execution. They're simplifying their geographic setup, and they believe that the changes will hopefully reduce the duplication of processes. We know that HSBC has been trying to rein in costs against a backdrop of falling interest rates. So perhaps this is part of that of those changes for the bank. The bank is also saying that the functions realign to support their 4 new businesses, and the structure changes will be effective from January 1st, 2025. And so the breaking news that we are getting at just right now is the appointment of Pam Kour as Group CEO. It's also a busy morning for us because we're paying close attention to Europe car sales, because that is also some new numbers that we're getting right now. If we take a look at Europe car sales, they drop 4.2% to 1.12 million units in September. Why this is notable is because we've been paying close attention to the European market in terms of car registrations. And right now, clearly gains in electric vehicle sales have not been enough to offset declines for combustion engine models. We've been paying close attention to this because this is the worst showing for Europe in more than 2 years. So a lot of breaking news that we're getting this hour. We'll continue to pay close attention And let's go back to our breaking news from HSBC, because we are paying close attention to this news. We just got this. Group CFO Pam Kour is the first female to be appointed in this job for HSBC. This is breaking news that we're getting just at this hour. And again, the bank is saying they're simplifying their organizational structure from January 1st of 2025. Hopefully, these new functions and these new changes will help support their new businesses and will reduce the duplication of processes and hopefully support the bank in reining in costs. We'll continue to pay close attention to this story. All right, so back to the markets today. Bonds from Australia to Japan are falling as investors consider cooling expectations of U.S. interest rate cuts for the first of the year. However, San Francisco Fed President Mary Daly says she doesn't see reasons to stop cutting rates, despite other Fed officials favoring a slower pace.
So far, I haven't seen any information that would suggest we wouldn't continue to reduce the interest rate. This is a very tight interest rate for an economy that already is on a path to 2% inflation. And I don't want to see the labor market slow further.
The U.S. dollar boosted by climbing Treasury yields and weighed on Asian bonds and currencies. Let's bring in Charu Chanana, FX strategy head at Saxo Markets, who joins me now from Singapore. So, Charu, thanks so much for joining us. As we mentioned, we got a bunch of Fed speak on Monday, and it seems to be a consensus about easing, but not exactly the pace at which we're going to see easing. How are you interpreting a lot of this rhetoric that we got on Monday?
Hi, Jen. Thank you for having me on the show. Certainly, I think stepping back a little bit in September when the Fed cut rates by 50 basis points, I think since then the market has obviously been, too aggressive in its expectations for rate cuts, expecting 50 basis points at every meeting in November and December. But, you look at the data, the macro data still does not support the case for those aggressive Fed rate cuts. And that is exactly what has been playing out in the last few weeks. We've seen macro data as well as the Fed speakers pushing back a little bit on those aggressive rate cut expectations. Certainly, the pace of rate cuts from here is going to be more calibrated, and it will completely depend on what kind of a weakening we see in the economy there. And that does mean that, we could get a 25 and 25 in November or December, or maybe even just another 25 basis points through to the end of the year, which is exactly the different, rhetoric that we're getting from the Fed speakers as well, Mary Daly as well. None of the Fed speakers for now are obviously ruling out further rate cuts, even this year where we have only 2 meetings left. I think the big focus will be on that non-farm payroll number out next week. Certainly the PCE data, the inflation metric that the Fed watches, that will also be a little bit more important than it has been in the last few months. The focus has shifted very much on the growth side of the story, but I think inflation is again coming back into focus a little bit because of the outperformance that we've seen in the U.S. economic data last few weeks. But the non-farm payrolls data, I think that will be the real trigger or the driver behind what kind of a pace we see, specifically, in as short term as November and December.
Charu, what does that mean for bond yields in particular? We mentioned the global sell-off that we've seen overnight since Monday. Does this continue to be a volatile period for global bonds until we get some of this data that you're pointing to?
Absolutely. So the Fed is in a data-dependent mode. That is certainly something that is creating quite a bit of volatility. But the other reason here being the U.S. elections, which, just 2 weeks away. And I think, of course, that is something which is very, very critical to the long-end bond yields in particular, because, both of the candidates have actually, are looking at more fiscal spending, more kind of, debt concerns coming up for the U.S. So this is a story where long-end yields will continue to react to. So I think, yes, this is going to be a volatile period. Certainly the short-end bond yields reacting a little bit more to the Fed side of the story and the economic data side of story, but the long-end yields kind of potentially anchored a little bit higher as we head into that election period.
And finally, Charu, for the dollar, because we're seeing a lot of currencies globally being affected by the stronger dollar. Does this again continue, or do we see a pullback potentially coming in the near term?
I mean, I would go back to what I said earlier, right? I mean, even though we've seen some amount of softening in US economy, I think there has been no data so far that kind of questions that US exceptionalism story. I think that really is a key driver of US dollar at this point. If you look at Eurozone, obviously the data there continues to kind of make those growth concerns bigger. And those are coming into the focus for the ECB as well. We've seen plenty of stimulus measures from China, but none of that has really turned the narrative completely to say that China is on a strong growth path, right? So certainly US continues to appear in a better position than anywhere else, and that continues to drive flows into US assets and US dollar particularly. There would be obviously some periods of pullback because, having said that, this is a period where the Fed is easing rates, but I don't see any structural risks for the US dollar as of now because of that strong US exceptionalism story.
Charu, great to get your insights this morning. Thanks so much for joining us. That's Charu Chanana, FX strategy head at Saxo Markets there in Singapore for us. All right, coming up, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is on his 11th visit to the Middle East as the U.S. tries to secure a ceasefire deal in Gaza and Lebanon just 2 weeks before the U.S. presidential election. More on this next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Jennifer Zabasaja in Johannesburg. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is on his way for an 11th visit to the Middle East in his so far unsuccessful effort to engineer a ceasefire between Israel and Iran-backed militants. Blinken is set to meet with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, as well as Defense Minister Yoav Gallant in Tel Aviv, as he tries to secure a pause in Israel's multi-front conflict with Hamas in Gaza and Hezbollah in Lebanon before the U.S. presidential election. Meanwhile, U.S. envoy Amos Hochstein is in Beirut urging a diplomatic solution before the situation escalates out of control. The visit comes after Israel widened its bombing campaign in Lebanon over the weekend, targeting financial institutions it says help fund Hezbollah's military operations. For more on this, Bloomberg's Paul Wallace is joining us now. Paul leads our MENA economy and government coverage. So, Paul, how likely will the U.S. be able to secure a ceasefire before the November 5th election, which we've noted all morning is just about 2 weeks away?
Hi, Jennifer. Yes, as you say, just 2 weeks away now. I think it's going to be a pretty tough ask for U.S. diplomats to achieve a ceasefire either in Gaza or in Lebanon in that time frame. Israel just, at the moment, sees itself as on the front foot in both places and degrading Hamas and Hezbollah to a massive degree. And it thinks that these military gains that it's been making in the last several weeks, if not few months, are very much in its favor when it comes to eventual diplomatic talks and eventual ceasefire negotiations. So I think it will be very difficult for the U.S. to achieve a truce in either place in the next 2 weeks.
So then, Paul, what then is the purpose, would you say, of the trip by U.S. diplomats, especially if we think about the fact that Israel has been preparing for a potential retaliation on Iran? I mean, what then is the purpose of this trip?
Yeah, you mentioned Iran. I mean, Blinken's trip has, in many ways, this is his 11th trip to the region since October the 7th, 2023. In some ways, it's the most complicated one because, as you mentioned, it's not just Gaza now, which was the basis for most of his trips to the Middle East, achieving a ceasefire there. He's now also got to try and do the same with Lebanon, given Israeli troops are on the ground there in the south of the country. And there's also the issue of Iran, with Israel still saying it will retaliate against the Islamic Republic for its missile attack on Israel on October the 1st. So there's plenty of things going on. I think one of the things he wants to achieve certainly is to contain what's going on, to ensure that things don't escalate even further in the run-up to the U.S. elections. he's almost certainly going to discuss with the Israelis their retaliation against Iran and reiterate that the US does not want Israel to go after Iran's energy, or certainly energy export facilities or nuclear sites, because that would provoke, in all likelihood, a very harsh reaction from Iran and exacerbate the conflicts in the region.
Yeah. Paul Wallace in Dubai. We'll leave it there. Paul, thanks so much for your reporting and for joining us this morning. Coming up, the BRICS Summit kicks off in Russia as President Vladimir Putin looks to show his country is still accepted on the world stage. More on what the alliance is hoping to achieve next. This is Bloomberg.
We have a nice position in South Africa, for example, in e-commerce, where we have taken a lot in South Africa. We also have many classified business in South Africa and some news business in South Africa. So we expected to keep being the most important internet company in South Africa and keep investing in Africa, in Eastern and Central Europe. I think that's the opportunity for Prosus. We are a big tech with 30,000 people and a capability to invest billions of dollars that can invest in Africa, in Europe, in Latin America, and in India.
That was Fabrizio Blasi, CEO of Prosus and Naspers, discussing investment capabilities after the company announced profit would hit $400 million for the year ending in March. That compares to $38 million in the same period a year earlier. Now for a look at some other stories we're following. Europe's biggest software company, SAP, has reported a jump in third quarter cloud sales as it works to move customers to its AI tools and analytics. Cloud revenue rose to nearly $5 billion, marking a 25% increase from a year earlier. Its cloud backlog rose to over $16 billion, reflecting sales to be booked over the next 12 months. Disney has named James Gorman as chairman and says it will also appoint a new CEO in early 2026. Gorman is the former CEO of Morgan Stanley and was tapped in August to head Disney's succession planning. Bob Iger returned to the top job in 2022 after the ouster of his successor, Bob Chapek. Iger now says he will leave for good this time when his contract expires. Qualcomm has unveiled a more powerful processor that's designed to bring laptop-level capabilities to smartphones. The shift in design is expected to help mobile devices take advantage of new AI tools. Qualcomm says the new chip will be 45% faster than the previous model and use less energy. And a two-day BRICS Summit begins in Kazan, Russia today. We are following this closely. It's widely seen as an opportunity for President Vladimir Putin to show his country is still accepted on the world stage. That is, of course, despite Western sanctions. Bloomberg Intelligence says the further enlargement of the bloc, with 10 more countries applying to join, could see its share of world GDP double to that of G7 countries by the late 2030s. For more, let's bring in Bloomberg News Desk editor Jill Desis, who's joining us now. So, Jill, what exactly is the alliance looking to achieve, especially seeing that BRICS membership has also now expanded for the first time?
Well, Jen, what we're seeing here, first of all, is really kind of a show of force from Russia's perspective on the world stage. This is actually the largest gathering of world leaders in Russia since the outbreak of Russia's war in Ukraine a few years ago. So just sort of on that measure, you're seeing what's kind of an attempt here by Putin to kind of show this, Western-led world order that, he still has quite a lot of allies, or at least can sort of create some of these, big lasting partnerships. What this actually means for BRICS, though, so you've got several new members that are kind of coming in for the first time, really having that seat at that table, the UAE, Iran, Egypt. The question here, though, is whether BRICS would actually continue expanding out. I think it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 32 countries that are being represented in Russia at this event. Does this actually expand beyond the existing BRICS membership? That's something that they ultimately may start to be hashing out during this meeting.
Yeah, and Jill, it's interesting that this is coming also as we see a number of leaders in Washington for the IMF and World Bank meetings. I mean, if we just focus, though, on what is happening in Russia, China and India, two of the prominent members, of course, they ended a long-time border stalemate, potentially then opening the door for Xi and Modi to meet. Is that really the highlight we should be paying close attention to?
Yes, Jen, I think that's ultimately probably one of the biggest deliverables that you could really get out of this entire event here. Now, we've been seeing some signs of potential thawing between China and India for at least a little bit of time here. But yes, overnight you had this development that they've ended, or at least to sort of put off this border dispute that really ratcheted up about 4 years ago or so, when you had several casualties happening along in the Himalayas along the China-India border. That actually led to, quite a bit of tension between these two nations. You had India launching some boycotts, bans on Chinese businesses. In addressing some of these border issues, what now you're kind of seeing is this potential for what could be the first bilateral meeting between Chinese President Xi and Indian Prime Minister Modi in 2 years. They did have a chance to meet on the sidelines of last year's BRICS Summit, but not in that big formal bilateral setting. We might get one of those this week.
And Jill, I'm glad you mentioned last year. I was covering the BRICS Summit when it was here in South Africa. One of the main points that was a continuing discussion was about a united currency, potentially to counter the dollar. In terms of economic developments, are you anticipating anything to come from this summit?
We'll have to see. I mean, there's certainly some nations that are members of BRICS, Russia, China, most at the forefront, that would favor, a world order that isn't as reliant on the dollar, is looking for other ways in which to increase the value of other foreign currencies in that system. That's certainly, a proponent of, some of these nations that are within BRICS. Not every nation, though, may necessarily feel that way, and there may be some conflict over, how much, this increase in foreign currencies relative to the dollar's power worldwide. But ultimately, having some of those members, I'm sure that is a topic for discussion among these countries that are traveling to Russia for this meeting. Whether that actually results in anything tangible coming out of that's what we'll ultimately have to see here.
Yeah, we'll pay close attention to that. Bloomberg News' desk editor, Jill Desis. Jill, thanks so much for joining us. Now, coming up, one of the most crucial events of the year, the U.S. presidential election, is just 2 weeks away, believe it or not, with polls showing Donald Trump and Kamala Harris neck and neck. We have the analysis next. This is Bloomberg. This is Horizon's Middle East and Africa, our top stories this morning. Asian stocks follow Wall Street lower and global bonds tumble as Fed rate cut expectations cool. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken is set to arrive in Israel today, his 11th visit to the region since October 7th to broker a ceasefire deal. Plus, election countdown with 2 weeks to go until the United States votes. Polls place Harris and Trump neck and neck. It is just gone 8:30 a.m. across the Emirates, 6:30 a.m. here in South Africa. I'm Jennifer Zabasaja in Johannesburg, filling in this week for Jumana Bersetchi. Let's take a look at where markets are positioned ahead of the trading day. As we mentioned, we did see a global bond sell-off. I will get to that in just a second, but I want to start off really with equities, and U.S. equities looking a bit softer today, and that is coming after Monday. They had a bit of a mixed session on Monday. They came under pressure to start the week, and that, of course, came after last week, which we saw the indices really continuing to deliver strong results. This week, though, Wall Street faces a big earnings hurdle with roughly 20% of the S&P 500 companies scheduled to release results. I mentioned the global bond sell-off. Right now, if we take a look at the 10-year yield at about 4.2095, and really what we did see on Monday, potentially driving some of the sell-off, is a lot of Fed speak that we got, aligning with a more cautious approach to easing. Also paying close attention to oil. Brent crude just above $74 a barrel, and that is coming after rising almost 2% on Monday. That is, of course, course, as traders continue to track tensions in the Middle East. Let's check in, though, on how markets in Asia are faring. Avril Hong, of course, is standing by in our Singapore studio. Hey, Avril.
Hey, Jen. Yeah, those higher U.S. yields, really uncomfortable backdrop for Asia equities. The region's benchmark sliding for a second day and to the lowest level in about a month as traders trim their Fed rate cut bets. Of course, this is influenced by some of the cautious Fed speak, the data out of the U.S. that's looking pretty solid, and of course, the firming bets about a Trump victory and how that might influence fiscal spending. So you put that together, there is a bit of a reckoning underway in bond markets, not just on Fed expectations, but the RBA as well, as we had officials this week, one of them actually leaving the door open for a late cycle hike. So a bit of a double whammy we're seeing on the 10-year in Australia. It's not just stocks and bonds that are selling off today. We are also seeing a lot of pressure coming through for EM Asia currencies, given the resurgence in the US dollar, the Philippine peso and Indonesian rupiah getting particularly hard hit today, Jen.
Thanks so much, Avril Hong, standing by in Singapore for us. And it's a busy Tuesday today. We want to just bring a bit of breaking news to you, and that is coming from the Hyundai India debut. We just got some updates that at the debut, the shares dropped more than 1%. We're seeing quite a bit of fluctuation as it comes to the debut. And why we're paying close attention to this is because this was a record IPO. We were paying close attention because shares of Hyundai Motor India were set to begin trading today, and that came after a $3.3 billion IPO. That was the South Asian nation's largest ever. So we'll continue to pay close attention to what these shares do over the course of the next few days. Let's pivot, though, to another story we brought you just a little while ago. HSBC says it is simplifying its organizational structure into 4 businesses and has announced Pam Kour, its first female CFO. For more on this breaking news from the top of the hour, Bloomberg's global business reporter, Karen Lee, is joining us from Sydney. So, Karen, what exactly does this new structure look like? Walk us through this.
Well, this is interesting, and I'm just getting across it myself. But taking a look at the statement here, I'm seeing they're going to merge 2 of their largest businesses outside the UK and Hong Kong and restructure regionally. And that's going to look like them combining their global commercial and investment banking operations, according to the statement. And it's also going to create a new international wealth and premier banking business and set up both Western and Eastern regional units for that. And, of course, the announcement of Pam Kour as the first chief female financial officer. So a lot of changes underway at HSBC, and we're seeing that roll across now.
And we know you're still getting your head around this, but maybe you can talk us through what you make of the timing of this. We've been following closely what HSBC is doing. They're saying this will take effect January 1st. What do you make of the timing of the changes?
Well, look in particular at the context of how this is taking place. Chief Executive Officer George Al-Hedri has been looking to rein in costs against the background of falling interest rates. And just looking here now, central banks around the world beginning to cut those rates. And he's really been under pressure to trim those costs to protect margins. So he's asked staffers to be more careful with their spending, to put fresh limits on investment bankers' travel. And he said in the statement, taking a look at it, the new structure will result in a simpler, more dynamic and agile organization. And there's going to be a focus on executing against strategic priorities, and those remain unchanged. So it'll be interesting to see what this looks like, especially for staffers at the bank.
Yeah, and that's an important point there. Bloomberg's Karen Lee in Sydney joining us with our breaking news this morning. Karen, thanks so much. Let's pivot back to the U.S. election. With just 2 weeks left in the U.S. presidential election campaign, the polls still have Donald Trump and Kamala Harris neck and neck. The candidates are, of course, focusing on swing states, hoping to pick up whatever is left of undecided voters. Joining us now is Melanie Garson, Associate Professor of Conflict Resolution and International Security at the University College of London. So, Melanie, there's a lot of unknowns, really, if we take a look at the next 2 weeks. But what do you think will potentially drive the conversation and really what we see from the candidates over the next 14 days?
Yeah. Good morning. It's certainly a tricky 14 days. It's neck and neck. And I think it's, picking up those undecided voters and as well as motivating people to actually go and vote, those that do not feel convinced. Both will be seeking to give their most compelling vision. And I think, there's a lot of talk about the youth vote, and the youth votes are very mission driven. So the key will be to give that compelling vision. We have seen, a certain amount of receding into, if you want, unpleasant rhetoric between some of the parties. If they're smart and they really want to pick up their voters, they want to present themselves as that candidate, not as bickering, the one that can give leadership and vision and really drive forward.
How do you assess then, Melanie, what the two candidates are doing? They're differing a bit on terms of prioritizing where they are and what exactly they're doing. I mean, do you think they're adhering or trying to reach out to those undecided and potentially youth voters that you're mentioning there?
I think to a point they are. My take, and this is from sitting across the pond in the UK, almost seeing desperation tactics take over rather than logical tactics. So it's sort of trying to clutch at any straws that they can. As I say, neither in a neck and neck race, one of them really is, you're hoping to have that burst of energy to really drive it forward. We're not seeing that quite yet. So, as I say, I think the key is to find that moment, to find that momentum, and to deliver clarity and to deliver really big vision rather than giving people a question of, is it going to just be more of the same?
On what, though, Melanie, especially given you are sitting from across the pond? I mean, what do you think potentially could be that clear vision they give? Is it a strategy for foreign policy? Is it economic policies?
My take, although technically they say an election is always won on its domestic policy rather than its foreign policy, I think a clear strategy likely on economic policy. I think people want to know where they're going to be in 5 years' time. What does their life look like in 5 years' time? Can you give me a big vision of why my life would be better having voted for you?
But, I mean, Melanie, they have contrasting viewpoints. I mean, does one of these candidates have an edge potentially and actually have data to back up whatever argument they're presenting to voters?
Well, we're seeing, Kamala Harris having the slight edge right now. There's a lot of, but we've got that contrasting with Elon Musk having weighed in with Donald Trump and giving $1 million out here and there. And that will certainly speak to some people. As it stands, I think people will feel that some of the Harris approaches are more robust. They've been in place a little longer. Donald Trump occasionally feels like more of the wild card, and it's the question would be, can they drill it down and speak to those voters that really want to have that sense of economic security, and to some extent that will be tied into the foreign policy security, because the more that gets spent outside of the US, the less there is to really concentrate on the people within the US.
Right. And Melanie, let's just stick on that, because concurrently we are seeing U.S. diplomats traveling to the Middle East, trying to broker a ceasefire. I know you mentioned that American voters don't typically vote with foreign policy in mind, but what does the conflict potentially in the Middle East, what role does it play in this election for these two candidates?
Yes, and unusually, whilst as a rule, an election is won on domestic policy, the Middle East has that unfortunate position of inflaming passions and mind that people have a very definitive position on it. The likelihood of seeing, either two being able to contribute to, the extent that they're contributing to a resolution at this point before the election is challenging. The question of their positioning has to be both realistic vis-a-vis what, they stand by the values that they are advocating as part of their campaign. At the same time, it also has to be realistic in the sense of standing for a strong America as well externally. So, and that will be, finding that balance, finding that voice that can be respected and strong on the stage, and also respected to some of the constituent values, don't always go hand in hand.
Definitely one we'll pay close attention to. Melanie Garson, Conflict Resolution and International Security Associate Professor at the University College of London. Melanie, thanks so much for joining us this morning. Now, coming up, Bitcoin is paring gains after coming close to $70,000 following a rush of inflows into ETFs. Up next, we speak to the Ledger CEO on crypto optimism, especially as the U.S. election approaches. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Jennifer Zabasaja in Johannesburg. Bitcoin is paring gains after coming close to $70,000 following a rush of inflows into ETFs and optimism about the outlook for U.S. regulations after the election. The largest digital asset climbed nearly 10% in the 7 days through Sunday, along with smaller tokens such as Ether and Solana. Joining us now is Pascal Gauthier, the CEO of crypto wallet provider Ledger. Pascal, thanks so much for being with us. So let's just start with some of these moves. We did mention Bitcoin coming a bit off of those highs that we saw yesterday on Monday. Is your expectation, though, that things will continue climbing up for Bitcoin and subsequently maybe for some of these other tokens?
Look, it's possible, but I always say that at Ledger we are a security company, so we're not really focused on price action. What we say, though, is the price of Bitcoin is, number one, the security of the blockchain. So the higher the price, the more secure the Bitcoin blockchain is. And also now, it brings a lot of liquidity into the Bitcoin blockchain. And so that's very exciting because you have a lot of companies right now that are building applications on top of the protocol, on top of the Bitcoin blockchain. And the more liquidity, the better for them.
What do you think, Pascal, in terms of the impact that the U.S. election could have on this? I know you mentioned you're not focused on the price action, but surely you are focused on what potentially this could mean for crypto more broadly.
Oh, definitely. I think the U.S. election means two things. One, when in every country now you have probably a double-digit percentage of citizens having Bitcoin and other cryptocurrency, it has become a real, almost like a real political issue, if you like. And what was very interesting in the U.S. election is to see that, Bitcoin and sort of self-custody has now become a fundamental right. Like, it is your right to own Bitcoin and to self-custody it. And, that's what Ledger, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to bring tools so people can have their digital freedom. So I think it's very important what's happening right now in the U.S. And when it comes to price action, again, I think what we're going to see in the near future is, anyways, Bitcoin going up regardless of what's going to happen in the U.S. because it's a worldwide asset class and anyone can access Bitcoin from anywhere in the world. We've seen in the past that China had what people usually call a ban on Bitcoin, which was really a ban on exchanges. That had very little impact on where Bitcoin is today. And so I think regardless of who wins the election in the US, Bitcoin is on the rise for sure.
Pascal, what does this mean for Ledger more broadly? I mean, and I'm not just talking in the U.S. You're also in the UAE. Your headquarters is in Europe. I mean, are you planning expansion just given sort of the layout of the crypto industry globally?
For sure. At Ledger, we, for both of our consumer and enterprise business, we deliver everywhere in the world. We shipped at least one product in every country in the world. You're right to note that, for example, the UAE is a very important region for us. It's our fastest growing region. But as well, the US is 30% of our business. So, again, it's a testimony to the fact that Bitcoin and other cryptocurrency are completely global. Bitcoin is the only way to access, sort of digital value without intermediary everywhere in the world. Anyone has access anywhere in the world, which is why, I think it's such a huge phenomenon. And again, which is why I think price action has nothing to do with one single country, since you have billions of people that are going to access this online.
Let's finish in Europe, Pascal. There's some regulations that are going to be implemented later this year for the European Union. How is Ledger preparing for that?
Look, I think regulation in Europe vastly leaves self-custody alone. Again, self-custody is the right to own digital assets, the right for private property. And so I think legislators and regulators everywhere in the world understand the distinction between being a sovereign individual on the one side and also, fair regulation when it comes to financial institutions. So I think MiCA and regulation in Europe has to do with financial institutions, but doesn't have to do with the ability for citizens to own privately digital assets.
So no changes coming to the way you operate there?
No change is coming for us. We are a security company, and we're here to secure people and enterprise.
Wonderful. We'll leave it there. Pascal Gauthier, the CEO of Ledger, thanks so much for joining us in our Dubai studio. Coming up, a look at India's biggest IPO ever as Hyundai makes its $3.3 billion listing debut. We have the details next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to the Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Jennifer Zabasaja in Johannesburg. A bit of breaking news again for you this morning that we're following closely, and that is coming from the Middle East. We've been paying close attention to it. We have some word that Hezbollah says it fired missiles targeting the Tel Aviv suburbs, and Lebanon is saying that Israel's strike is near a Beirut hospital, potentially killing 4 people. The IDF, we're also hearing from them, say that there's sirens that sounded in central Tel Aviv and the surrounding areas. This, of course, coming, as we mentioned, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken making his 11th trip to the region since the October 7th attack, and hearing from Amos Hochstein saying that the situation had escalated out of control. Potentially, we see a ceasefire brokered, but we are still seeing these missiles happening this morning. We'll continue to follow this story throughout the morning for us. Let's pivot now to the Indian unit of Hyundai Motor. They've opened lower in its trading debut today in Mumbai. The $3.3 billion listing is India's biggest IPO. For more, let's bring in Asia Equity Capital Markets reporter Julia Fioretti. So, Julia, how significant is this IPO for India? Put this into context for us.
Well, Jennifer, it is extremely significant because it's India's record IPO. It's the biggest ever that the country has seen. It's surpassing the LIC IPO a couple of years ago. So there was a lot hinging on its performance and a lot hinging on this doing well. It's also significant because it's a foreign company selling a stake in its Indian subsidiary. And that's been quite a theme that we've seen in the Indian markets, where companies have been trying to take advantage of the high valuations in India to sell stakes in their subsidiaries. But the fact that this hasn't done well obviously doesn't exactly bode well for more of these transactions.
It's still a bit early, though, Julia. I mean, what are you making then of the share price drop?
Yes, for sure, it's still early. We need to see how it closes. We need to see how it does 1 month after listing. So whilst it doesn't have the first day pop that maybe it would have been hoping for, and that would have certainly kept the momentum going in India, it doesn't mean that it's all going to stop in India. The market is still extremely hot. There's still a lot of investor demand for IPOs in India. What it means probably is that the valuation was a little on the high end, and that they should have probably left a little bit of money on the table for investors.
Could this potentially have an impact on the rest of the pipeline then in India, Julia?
I unlikely to halt it. It's extremely strong in India. The markets are extremely busy, and so people are still going to tap the markets. It certainly might lead to a little bit more caution on valuations going forward.
All right, we'll leave it there. Asia Equity Capital Markets reporter Julia Fioretti joining us on this story that we have been following throughout the day. And just to recap on a lot of the news that we've been following this morning, and that is, of course, of HSBC. We have a bit of news as well from the company. Again, HSBC Europe head Colin Bell is expected or is going to depart on December 31st. We're getting a number of lines from HSBC over the past few hours. We also are hearing that HSBC Middle East head Stephen Moss to depart in an overhaul. We mentioned earlier at the top of the hour that the bank is looking to reorganize, simplify their structure, potentially try to rein in costs. So we're expecting to see potentially more of this restructuring happening. And of course, we mentioned earlier as well, they did name a CFO, the first female CFO in that role, Pam Kour. All right, that is Horizons Middle East and Africa for you on this Tuesday morning. I'm Jennifer Zabasaja in Johannesburg. Stick with us for Daybreak Europe. This is Bloomberg.